All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Hugh and Emma, and thank you for the invitation to speak here, and thank you all for coming today. I want to recognize the organizers of this series, Cecily and Marta, for your labor in putting this series together. And I'm also grateful to the queer and the classical team for their support of the seminar series, as well as for all of their work over the past 2 years, which has done a lot to forge community for people interested in these topics. I'm going to be talking about forging of a different kind today. And before I launch in here, I just want to say that what I'm presenting here is very much a work in progress. I don't generally believe in firsts or originals, as my talk will make clear, but this is the first time I am presenting this research to an audience. And so I'll be very grateful for any feedback, suggestions, questions, and reactions you have during the discussion period. I also want to give a heads up that during this presentation, I will be discussing some examples of colonialist and racist violence, mainly in the second half of the talk. And lastly, I am a little bit sick today, and so I apologize in advance if at any point I need to pause and take refuge in a tissue. Okay, I am going to share my screen. All right. There we go. Okay. In 1894, the Frenchman Pierre Louÿs brought to light a groundbreaking discovery. That year, the story goes, a German archaeologist, Herr Heim, had unearthed a tomb in Cyprus belonging to a certain Bilitis, a contemporary and one-time consort, Sappho. Scrawled on the wall of her tomb were 158 first-person poems, composed in ancient Greek, in which Bilitis recounted her life in 3 stages. Bucolics in Pamphylia, which describes her youthful innocence in her birthplace of Pamphylia in southern Turkey, elegies at Mytilene, which detail her erotic experiences with women, including Sappho, on the island of Lesbos, and epigrams on the Isle of Cyprus, which recount her time as a courtesan to Aphrodite. Louÿs took it upon himself to share the work of this hitherto unknown poetess to the public, translating her songs into French and dedicating the volume, this little book of ancient love, respectfully to the young ladies of the Society of the Future. The Songs of Bilitis are, of course, a fabrication, a forgery, a literary hoax. They fit squarely within the 19th century French literary tradition of male-authored fictions of female homoeroticism. And yet, Louÿs' Bilitis has often been heralded by classicists as a watershed moment, as part of an origin story for reclaiming and requeering Sappho from the clutches of misogynist, lesbophobic philologists. On the one hand, Louÿs' literary hoax so incensed Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Müllendorf that he rekindled Welker's notorious Sappho schoolmistress theory. As the centerpiece of his 1913 Sappho und Simonides, Wilamowitz decided to reprint his 16-page scathing indictment of Louÿs' Bilitis, which he had originally published in 1896. Writing, a volume of French poetry, some of which is disgustingly lewd, may seem unsuitable for review in this place, but I find it worthy of consideration and seize this opportunity to address matters long dear to my heart. I'm concerned with the purity of a great woman, i.e. Sappho. I'm not afraid to put my hands in the dirt, i.e. Bilitis. At the same time, the hoax also ignited a championing of sapphic desire by actual lesbians. In Fictions of Sappho, Joan de Jean writes, Pierre Louÿs dedicated the fiction that tormented Wilamowitz for over 20 years to the young ladies of the Society of the Future, a dedication that soon became a battle cry for the first female commentators of Sappho to proclaim both their feminism and their homosexuality. Indeed, Bilitis found a highly positive reception in contemporary Paris by the white and privileged members of the lesbian salon culture, in particular, Nathalie Barney and Renée Vivian, who were friends with Louÿs. In 1901, Barney dedicated her 5 short Greek dialogues to Louÿs, writing, there already exist young women of the society of the future who appreciate what you have done for them and who want to thank you, however incoherently and awkwardly. And Renee Vivian, long ago I bestowed on the Songs of Bilitis my passionate tenderness, which I reserve for a few books that are inseparable from my thinking and my existence. 60 years later, in 1955, the first lesbian rights organization in the United States would claim Bilitis as their maternal ancestor, calling themselves the Daughters of Bilitis. And here I have pictured the cover and first 2 pages of one of the organization's magazine, The Ladder. I'm not going to be talking so much about the Daughters of Bilitis today, but I would welcome questions and discussion after my talk. And finally, in her 2019 Edelon article about the long history of scholarly censorship of queerness and antiquity, Miriam Campbell locates in Bilitis, quote, an important moment in the history of homosexuality. Decades on, queer women were still reading and celebrating Sappho, seeing a mirror in her poetry, just as I did. In my presentation today, I want to complicate the narrative that has accrued around Bilitis as an originary spark that ignites a requeering of Sappho by framing Bilitis as an object that participates in a broader cultural and potentially queer history of forgery. First, I'm going to zero in on this hoax as a bibliographic object. How does this forgery play with authenticity and originality? How might this object problematize the status and materiality of other textual objects, especially those that we typically consider to fall outside of the category of forgeries? And second, I'm going to zoom out to consider how this object intersects with a broader cultural history of bibliographic hoaxes generated by white European and American men. And here I'm going to draw attention both to the queerness of Bilitis as a forgery and to how this queerness is inextricable from relations of power, in particular French colonialism and patriarchy. I don't mean to undermine the role Bilitis has played in helping certain contemporary and future lesbian and queer readers forge community, but rather my ultimate goal is to disturb the disciplinary impulse to slot Bilitis into a generally positive progress narrative of queering Sappho. In short, to illuminate the political stakes of how we choose to forge a narrative around this book. So let's begin by taking a closer look at how this object embodies the work of forgery and plays with originality as a construct. Harold Love defines literary forgery as work composed with the intention to deceive and then promulgated under the name of another. In simple terms, a literary forgery performs authenticity. And one strategy by which forgery stakes a claim to embody authority or originality is through the use of what Ruthven has called an authenticatory device. For the Songs of Bilitis, several paratextual elements do the work of such authenticatory devices. First, Louÿs prefaces his translation of the poems with a short essay on the life of Bilitis. Here he poses as a judicious, objective critic, both appearing to rely on reason while also fabricating gaps and absence to lend a feeling of credible antiquity. He writes, "She was the daughter of a Greek father and a Phoenician mother. She does not seem to have known her father, for he takes no part in the memories of her childhood. He may even have died before she was born. Otherwise, it would be difficult to explain how she came to bear a Phoenician name, which her mother alone could have given her." Louÿs also validates the internal content of the songs with historical external evidence, as well as the citation of a scholarly figure, one Herr Heim, a German archaeologist whom Louÿs has invented out of whole cloth to engender an objective scholarly tone. He writes, "We find her next at Mytilene, whence she had come by way of the sea, skirting the lovely shores of Asia. She was scarcely 16 years old, according to the conjectures of Herr Heim, who has established with an appearance of truth certain dates in the life of Bilitis from a verse which alludes to the death of Pittacos." Another textbook move of the forger that Louÿs contrives is to fabricate provenance. And he does so in language that frames the song's rediscovery as nothing short of a miracle. Her tomb was rediscovered by Herr Heim at Paleo-Limisso by the side of an ancient road not far from Amathus. These ruins have almost disappeared in the past 30 years, and the stones of the house in which Bilitis may have lived pave the quays of Port Said today. But the tomb was underground, according to the Phoenician custom, and it had even escaped the depredations of treasure hunters. Herr Heim penetrated into it through a narrow well filled with earth, and at the bottom of which he found a walled-up door which it was necessary to demolish. The low and spacious cavern, paved with slabs of limestone, had 4 walls covered with plaques of black amphibolite, upon which were carved in primitive capitals all the songs which will be read hereafter. One of the final authenticatory paratextual devices Louÿs includes is a completely bogus bibliography at the end of the songs. And in this, Louÿs actually cites Philomovitz, and I think this is one clear indication that Louÿs wasn't so interested in necessarily duping, but in sort of having his fun with Stern and particularly German scholars. Now, one thing that a forgery does in order to fuel belief in its authenticity is to tap into the desire of its audience. And that is where Sappho comes in. In the prefatory life of Bilitis, Louÿs writes, "Then Sappho was still beautiful. Bilitis knew her and speaks of her to us under the name of Sappho, which she bore in Lesbos. No doubt it was this admirable woman who taught the little Pamphylian the art of singing in rhythmic cadences and of preserving for posterity the memory of dearly cherished beings. Unhappily, Bilitis gives few details about this figure today so poorly known, and there is reason for regretting it. So precious would have been the slightest word about this great inspiratrix." And so perhaps to contemporary readers' dismay, Sappho is featured by name in only one song, Sappho. This is an image that I've taken from a 1914 copy housed in Columbia's Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, and I promise I'm not trying to be sort of artsy here with the angle of this photo, but this is simply as far as I could open the book and take a photo, given how tight the binding is. And I think this might tell us something about how much or how little this particular copy has actually been read and handled. And here is an English translation of Sappho's appearance. This is in the words of Bilitis: "I rub my eyes, it is already day, I think, ah, who is by my side, a woman? By Paphia I had forgotten. O Carites, how hot with shame I am. To what country have I come? What isle is this where love is comprehended in this fashion? If I were not so tired, I should think I had been dreaming. Can it be that this is Sappho? She sleeps. She certainly is beautiful, although, love that concessive, her hair is cut in virile fashion. But this strange face, this mannish bosom, and these narrow hips, I had best leave before she awakens. Alas, I am lying by the wall. I must step over her. I am afraid to brush against her hip, afraid that she might try to hold me back." By featuring the famous Sappho in only one poem by name, Louÿs plays into desire for the real Sappho by reproducing her authentic fragmentary status. Still, readers would have taken pleasure in coming across veiled and not so veiled allusions to Sappho's poetry, such as the poem Love, which is an obvious adaptation of Fragment 31. And I won't take the time to read this aloud in its entirety, but you can kind of gather the gist. Lastly, Louÿs adds an authenticatory hook by extrapolating in detail upon a figure who survives as but a name drop in Sappho's fragmentary corpus, Nasidika. This is on the right, an image from the kind of title page for the second section of the songs, in which Louÿs includes the actual fragment from Sappho, in which Nasidika is mentioned by name. Here she is described by Sappho as more shapely than soft, tender Gerino. Louÿs makes sure to flag this to readers in the Life, writing that in return for sort of being so oblique about Sappho, Bilitis has left us in 30 elegies the story of her friendship for a young girl of her age named Nasidika, who lived with her. We had already known this young girl's name through a verse of Sappho's, in which her beauty is exalted. But even this name was doubtful, and Berk was nearly convinced that she called herself simply Menais. The songs, which will be read further on, prove that this hypothesis should be abandoned. So Louÿs lends authenticity to his literary fabrications by showing how they themselves prove what textual editors of the real Sappho held to be true. And the Berk guy that he mentions here is Theodor Berk, whose 1854 critical edition of Sappho would have been the standard during Louÿs' time. So while Wilamowitz condemned this book, in large part because it presented a version of Sappho that he adamantly did not want to believe in, other scholars had different reactions. Apparently, one Hellenist claimed to already know the poetry of Bilitis, and several professors even sent Louÿs their own translations of her poems. This amusing chain of events hints at a deeper truth, which is that the philologist, in the words of Anthony Grafton, is entangled with the forger, like Laocoon and his serpents. In his essay on the ancient library of Alexandria, Daniel Heller-Rosen observes how philological mechanisms of identifying, correcting, cataloging, and copying corrupt and suspect texts ironically pave the way for forgeries and falsifications. In this way, philology is bound up in the very undoing of that which it claims to preserve and faithfully transmit. As Heller-Rosen puts it, philology nourishes itself on the erosion of history. It erects itself over the grave of that which it recovers, dwelling with necrophilic enthusiasm on everything in its past that has grown opaque and can no longer present itself as it once was. Philology ensures the continuation of a textual tradition at the same time as it destroys and buries it. And for Heller-Rosen, this is precisely how critical editions of ancient texts work. The philologist erects an authentic text upon the apparatus criticus, which embodies a graveyard of dismembered, corrupt, perhaps even counterfeit versions of the real text. A critical edition, like a forgery, is also a performance of authenticity. We can think about how the physical layout of the page of a critical edition creates a compelling illusion that says, hey, up here in the center is what X ancient author totally wrote, and down there in the app crit is what others promulgated falsely under his name. Louÿs' songs seem to channel this entanglement between philologist and forger with hyperbolic and even parodic flair, as they simultaneously recover the poems of Bilitis from a quite literal grave. Sorry, I need to blow my nose. From a quite literal grave, and only guarantee their transmission through destroying their status as original or autograph in the very process of translating them and remediating them into a typeset printed codex. So forgery in this sense disturbs, or maybe even queers, any pretense philology may possess to represent an unmediated original authorial ancient text. The fluid borders between the critic and forger suggest that any act of textual re-embodiment dabbles in the craft, though perhaps not the motives of forgery. And this phenomenon is perhaps particularly heightened in the case of such a fragmentary and highly mediated textual corpus as that of Sappho. And I wonder if we can consider how the craft of forgery permeates an artifact like Anne Carson's If Not Winter. Reading Carson's re-embodiment of Sappho feels real because she employs formal authenticating devices in her typography, brackets, ellipses, and the like, to create and even forge an illusion of Sappho's authentic fragmentary voice. If, as Ella Hasseltvert has argued, it is the negative space of Sappho's fragments that in part embodies the space of queer desire and potential for the reader, Carson reforges Sappho on the page in a way that affirms this desire. Forgery doesn't give readers the real thing any more than Carson gives us the real original Sappho. Both, to a certain extent, aim to give readers what they desire to be real or true. And what made Bilitis successful as a forgery was not that it definitively duped readers. If a forgery actually succeeds in doing this, it may cease to be a forgery at all. But rather, Bilitis was powerful because it resonated with what some readers desired to believe about the real Sappho and what they knew to be true about their own desires. In the second half of my talk, I'm going to situate this forgery more fully in relation to power by contextualizing it within a broader cultural history of bibliographic hoaxes, in particular ones generated by white European and American men. And there are two sort of parts to course number 2 here. I'm first going to illuminate the queer potential of Bilitis as a forgery through comparison to a contemporary queer icon, Oscar Wilde, whose afterlife experienced a veritable explosion of forgeries. And second, I'm going to argue that this queerness is also inextricable from a larger story about bibliographic hoaxes, a story that is bound up in the intersecting forces of colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. And in this regard, I'm taking my cue from Kajiamin's call in Disturbing Attachments to de-idealize and de-exceptionalize queerness so that we can analyze queer possibility as inextricable from relations of power, queer deviance as intertwined with normativity, and queer alternatives as not necessarily just alternatives. So, what do Oscar Wilde and Bilitis have to do with one another? Let me begin by offering a word of caution as I introduce Wilde. I think historically there has been a tendency to over-idolize Bilitis, but this pales in comparison to the idolization of Oscar Wilde as a queer icon. And here I just want to amplify the critical work that Imani Perry has done in her book, Vexy Thing, to understand how Wilde both participated in relationships of domination with male youth in colonial Algeria, at the same time as he himself became subject to discipline under a heterosexist patriarchal regime. And these are some of the complex political coordinates I want to get into in part two of this talk. So I'm talking about Wilde here because I am primarily interested in how a particular phase of his afterlife intersects with Bilitis, who is part of Sappho's afterlife, and whether this intersection might help us situate Bilitis within a potentially queer history of forgery. As Gregory Mackie has traced in his recent book, Beautiful Untrue Things, Oscar Wilde posthumously attracted the hands of numerous figures who forged a wide array of literary transgressions, from fabricating original Wilde manuscripts to promulgating their own work, often inspired by Wilde, under Wilde's name. What factors, Mackie asks, made Wilde such an attractive subject for these creative imposters in the decades following his death in Paris in 1900? Well, one factor was the contested and uncertain status of Wilde's literary reputation following the 1895 trials that led to his imprisonment on charges of gross indecency. In the wake of these trials and Wilde's bankruptcy, his literary property was hastily auctioned off and dispersed. After his death in 1900, 3 men, Robert Ross, his literary executor, the bibliographical compiler Christopher Millard, and the collector Walter Ledger, sought to gather and compile an authoritative canon of Wildean material in order to recuperate Wilde's literary and cultural reputation and to create an authoritative archive purged of false and fraudulent materials. As we know by now, however, the forger follows closely on the coattails of the critic, And these bibliographical efforts of Wilde's literary guardians to restore an authentic Wilde, which included the publication of a massive 14-volume edition of Wilde's collected works in 1908, produced source material and bibliographical knowledge and methods that in fact paved the way for their worst nightmare, the saturation of the book market with pseudo-Wildeana. Of the forgers Mackie profiles in this book, one of the most interesting for my purposes today is Dorian Hope, a name that should immediately raise eyebrows if you are familiar with Oscar Wilde's work. Dorian Hope operated from Paris and produced a large corpus of pseudo-Wilde material. In 1921, the London bookselling firm Maggs Brothers began to receive a number of manuscripts purportedly written by Wilde himself, including an autographed copy of Wilde's play Salome. This Maggs purchased with glee, impressed as they were by its provenance. Its sender claimed to be none other than Pierre Louÿs, Wilde's close friend who helped him edit the play's French version. Upon further examination, however, Maggs Brothers determined that this manuscript was inauthentic. The paper had been produced after 1915 by a paper manufacturer in Massachusetts, and the Paris address used by Pierre Louÿs was in fact the Paris American Express office. After conferring with other booksellers who had also received suspicious materials, Maggs determined that the author of the forgery was one Dorian Hope. And Dorian Hope, Mackie reveals, was actually the forger alias of an American man from Gastonia, North Carolina, named Brett Holland, who, before moving to Paris, had made his debut in the States as both a plagiarist poet and a drag performer. Mackie argues that the Dorian Hope forgeries had the effect of queering the Wilde archive in the sense of rendering it strange and uncertain. Dorian Hope also queered the Wilde archive in another way, however. In correspondence, using period slang and innuendo, he marked himself as sexually queer. Now, Mackie shows how in the case of Dorian Hope and others, the production of these materials cannot be explained purely out of desire for financial gain. If not for the money, why take the risk? Here, Mackie reframes the practice of forgery through attending to Wilde's literary corpus itself. The forgers, in fact, follow Wilde's lead stylistically and thematically. As Mackie writes, forgery occupies a central position in Wilde's aesthetic philosophy and may well be the master Wildean metaphor for artistry and creativity. For Wilde, forgery is a theatrical art at the core of artistic creation. And this is well demonstrated by his story, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., in which a network of homophile men become enamored and attached to a portrait of one Mr. Willie Hughes, which has been forged by one of the story's characters in order to corroborate his theory that Shakespeare, in fact, wrote his sonnets out of love for a boy actor of that name. Ultimately, Mackie reframes the culture around Wilde forgeries as one of fan fiction, a community of Wilde fans bound together through ties of queerness, desire, and loss. He writes, to forge Wilde by generating fakes attached to his name is not only an exercise in role-playing, it is also necessarily a form of imaginative appropriation and reinvention. In this light, I consider the often playful textual impostures analyzed here as forms of fan fiction, which Karen Hellickson and Christina Boos define as the imaginative interpolations and extrapolations by fans of existing literary worlds. Is it possible for us to understand Louÿs' literary hoax in the way that Mackie understands some of these Wilde forgeries, as a kind of sapphic fan fiction that queers the Sappho archive? Surely the Songs of Bilitis imaginatively extrapolates from the existing fragmentary world of Sappho's poetry. But its status, if we want to assign it that as imaginative extrapolatory fan fiction, does not unmoor it from the politics of the real world in which it is forged. And in the remainder of my talk, I want to historicize Bilitis as originating from a very particular cultural milieu and in relation to a tradition of other bibliographic hoaxes generated by white European and American men. Bilitis is often framed by classicists as a point of origin for future feminist and or queer reclaimings of Sappho. But Bilitis herself stems not so much from any real feminist desire on Pierre Louÿs' part to stick it to lesbophobes like Filomovitz. Rather, Bilitis is a product of an orientalizing colonialist gaze. And at least in my preliminary research, I have found that these dynamics are foregrounded in writing by people outside of the discipline of classics proper. Gretchen Schultz, for example, tells us that Louÿs drew inspiration for his character of Bilitis from a very young Algerian girl he had been involved with. She writes, "It is perhaps not surprising to find Orientalist exoticism coloring Louÿs' representation of ancient Greece in a text where lesbianism plays such an important role. Wondrous and mysterious both, the foreign excitement of lesbianism and the Arab world permeate each other. The lesbian becomes a figure of the stranger, the Arab is hypersexualized like the lesbian, and both are rendered radically other in literature and other cultural manifestations of the period." Louÿs himself wrote to an unidentified correspondent in 1898 that I gave the book a character less Hellenistic than Asiatic in accordance with my preferences and Bilitis's biography. Louÿs, like Oscar Wilde, profited from the violence of colonialism, and his writings, including Bilitis, are shaped by this position of power from the very beginning. And here is the very first of the songs of Bilitis, called "The Tree." This is from Bilitis's childhood in Pamphylia. "I undressed to climb a tree, my naked thighs embraced the smooth and humid bark, my sandals climbed upon the branches. High up, but still beneath the leaves and shaded from the heat, I straddled a widespread fork and swung my feet into the void. It had rained. Drops of water fell and flowed upon my skin. My hands were soiled with moss and my heels were reddened by the crushed blossoms. I felt the lovely tree living when the wind passed through it. So I locked my legs tighter and crushed my open lips to the hairy nape of a bough." As Louÿs rather voyeuristically ventriloquizes the child Bilitis, it is clear that she exists, is made, is forged as a body to pleasure a certain kind of audience. Thomas Engelking has argued that Bilitis was likely intended for a circle of French male readers, noting how Louÿs' real-life interests in girls, lesbians, and courtesans mapped on to the three respective stages he assigned to Bilitis' life. Louÿs may claim that these songs were newly discovered, but they are part of a familiar genre of materials whose claims to newness would have been part of the fantasy for this audience. For example, in his 2014 book, The Homoerotics of Orientalism, Joseph Allen Boone traces a tradition of ethnopornography as evidence for a European clientele hungry for pederastic imagery and a commodification of the Near East as a setting for Europeans' pederastic fantasies. Boone also notes that there is a long tradition of hoaxes that parade as original work as part of this genre. So purported translations of ancient Eastern erotica, newly discovered manuscripts, imprints, and the like. And one interesting object that Boone describes is a book called Le Livre des Beaux, first printed anonymously in Paris in 1909. In the introduction, the text claims to be an accurate French translation of an Ottoman Turkish poem, Kuban Name, Book of Beautiful Boys, composed in the 1790s by Fazil Bey and Daruni. In the Turkish poem, the poet is asked by his lover to reveal which nations are filled with the most beautiful countenances of youths, which have the most beautiful men. Tell me A to Z. While the French version claims to be an accurate translation of the Turkish original, Boone shows how in fact the result is a product of this anonymous author's imagination and Orientalist investments. He writes, "The French text creates out of whole cloth a number of portraits of boys of nationalities, countries, and cities not included in the late 18th century Turkish manuscript. These additions extend its Orientalist reach to include the beaux of Ceylon, Java, Malaysia, China, and Borneo. Even more revealing is the fact that the French volume omits all the portraits of Western youth who figure as objects of desire in Fazil's A to Z taxonomy. Evidently, the French author-translator assumed that such Occidental objects of desire were not foreign enough to meet the exotic expectations of a select European readership in quest of Orientalist thrills. For our purposes, the plot thickens ever so slightly when we learn that the 1909 Le Livre de Beaux was reprinted in 1969, only this time with an endnote that mysteriously remarks that some people have attributed the 1909 publication to Pierre Louÿs, as well as André Gide. For Boone, these attributions in the 1969 reprinting might speak to a publisher's ploy to sell more copies of this book, as well as to this text's modernist, queer, and Orientalist investments. And for me, the citation of Louÿs suggests the importance of understanding the Songs of Bilitis as part of this genre. And a quick sidebar on André Gide, who was friends with both Louÿs and Wilde. This particular copy of the Songs of Bilitis that I have consulted in Columbia's collections states on the inside of its front cover that it's been presented to the collections by one Mrs. Justin O'Brien, which seemed curious to me. And upon a quick Google search, it would appear that she was the wife of Mr. Justin O'Brien, who had been a professor of French at Columbia and a prominent biographer and translator of Gide. So there is and O'Brien's papers apparently are at Columbia. So there is perhaps a sort of bigger story to tell about the homosocial network in which this object is legible as part of this literary genre of Western colonialist discovery or translation of an exoticized and homoerotic Eastern past for the benefit and pleasure of a Western gaze. And that these hoaxes were compelling, that they were sought after, says less about any truth that they express and more about the relationship between power and desire. There's one final story of the hoax that I want to think about Bilitis in relation to in order to draw out the dynamics of power that this object negotiates, as well as the dynamics of power that we might reproduce depending on the narratives that we generate around it. On and off for the past year or so, I have been making my way through a book by Kevin Young called Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News. This tome is a powerful archaeology of the hoax as we know it in American culture. For Young, the hoax as a genre in 19th century America, a period whose love of humbug allowed the new republic to marvel at its mysteries, question its hypocrisies, and express contradictions of freedom and slavery. Young begins by looking at P.T. Barnum's American Museum and its numerous racist exhibitions. One of Barnum's first invented characters was Joyce Heth, an enslaved woman whom he claimed to be the nursemaid of George Washington, which in 1835 would have made her 161 years old. In this case, as in others, Barnum's white audience members were put in the role of judges, and the hoax worked not only to provide perverse entertainment, but also offered them proof of their own superior humanity. Young situates this burgeoning genre of the hoax firmly within the rise of eugenics and racist pseudoscience such as phrenology, and throughout his book, he traces the entanglement between the hoax and racialization, writing, I've come to realize the hoax regularly steps in when race rears its head, exactly because it too is a fake thing pretending to be real. Young traces how various strains of the 19th century hoax are still with us today. One example he gives is the Orientalist and exoticist fantabulation of the lesbian by white American male writers. He tells the story of Amina Araf, a self-identified Syrian-American lesbian who began a blog in 2011 called Gay Girl in Damascus. This blog gained quite a following, and Amina even had a long-distance girlfriend at one point. Soon, however, Amina went quiet during the uprising known as the Arab Spring, and readers initiated an internet campaign to find her. Soon thereafter, the Washington Post revealed that Amina Araf was in fact Tom McMaster, a white man from Georgia. McMaster confessed to using Amina as a fake online profile for years. He had invented a backstory for her, as well as a whole cast of characters and family members. He was even planning to publish a fake memoir in her voice. The hoax began innocently enough, in McMaster's words, but once things got out of hand, he decided to put an end to things by having Amina kidnapped. As for the fake memoir, Young writes, I can report it's a hot mess. Orientalist and exoticist depicting the Middle East as a place of secret sexuality. Young situates McMaster's hoax within a history that should by now ring familiar to us. He writes, the idea of fake lesbians too has always been conflated with the Oriental. Sexy harems and poetesses have a long history of being fantasized and fantabulated by male writers, much like in the Songs of Bilitis, 1894, by Pierre Louÿs. Bilitis and Gay Girl in Damascus were forged in and from rather different contexts, over 100 years apart. But in both cases, Louÿs and McMaster's fabrications center their own desires, privileges, assumptions, and ultimately whiteness. For Young, it is McMaster's, quote, innocence, as presumptive as his all-consuming and all-assuming whiteness that constitutes the real crime. By situating Bilitis within a broader bibliographic and cultural history of hoaxes, we can see how this book engages Western colonialist desires to handle something new and exotic, yet still familiar in its Orientalist portrayal of lesbianism. This is not to say that this object isn't queer, and I do think the Oscar Wilde forgeries / fan fictions might help us place this object within a queer history of forgery, but rather that its queerness must be understood within a broader matrix of unsavory, racialized, and gendered dynamics of power. And this is why we need to be particularly careful about the narrative we choose to forge around this object. As a forgery, this object tells a certain story about its own originality and groundbreaking quality. And in a sense, it is this aesthetic and rhetoric of the new that has loomed large in the scholarly discourse around Bilitis, particularly within classics. When Joan de Jean writes that Bilitis became a battle cry for the first female commentators of Sappho to proclaim both their feminism and their homosexuality, who is amplified and who is erased by the adjective first? Emily Greenwood, in her recent talk, The Black Sappho, has argued for an eccentric and queer reception of Sappho by Black women authors as a counterpoint to the white, wealthy Parisian salon culture. Instead of declaring Bilitis the pivotal moment in Sappho's afterlife, why not Anna Julia Cooper's reclamation of Sappho in A Voice from the South, one of the first manifestos of Black feminist thought, published in 1892, that's 2 years prior to Louis' Bilitis. If this forgery teaches us anything about the real Sappho, it is that Sappho is forged discursively and materially out of not one, but many points of origin. And these origin points, as Louis' forgery throws into stark relief, are themselves always already mediated and never politically neutral. Thank you.